Right, here's what's happening. It's a Saturday in September. You're in a field in Aberdeenshire, and the sky is doing that typically Scottish thing where it just can't commit to a single decision. It's neither blue nor grey, but a combination of both. Almost as if it started the day full of ambition and then quickly ran out along the way. That's fine. Completely normal. We even have a word for it that you might remember from a previous episode. There's a smell of fried food in the air because, well, it's Scotland. And there's someone selling homemade tablet from a stall near the entrance because there's always someone selling homemade tablet and it's rude not to stop and grab some. And then there's a sound that can only really be described as the sound of several angry cats fighting over the last saucer of milk. And you realise it's the pipe band warming up. Now, I'm going to be really careful here because I do actually love the pipes. I'm Scottish and I'm contractually obliged to do so. But I will say with the greatest affection that the sound of a pipe band warming up is not the same as the sound of a pipe band playing. Warming up, you can understand why they were once used as a weapon of war. But then something happens. The drones settle, the chanter finds its note and it locks in, and it becomes one of the most stirring sounds on earth. The transformation happens in about 30 seconds and it never stops being remarkable. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, in the middle of the field, there's a man. A very large man. The kind of large that makes you reconsider your understanding of what the word large actually means. And he's wearing a kilt. And we'll talk about the kilts. And he's holding a pine tree trunk against his shoulder. Not a small piece of wood, a pine tree trunk. Almost 20 feet long and weighing somewhere in the region of 175 pounds. He's cradling it in the way you might cradle a slightly oversized baby, if that baby were made of timber and it took a full team of people to lift it. And he begins to run. With a tree. He plants his foot, he heaves, and the trunk goes end over end through the air, and it lands pointing directly away from him. The crowd cheers. And someone nearby who's applauding vigorously says, "Oh aye, that was a crackery a toss." Welcome to the Highland Games. I'm Lesley Kennedy and this is Everything Scotland. And although I may be a woman who has not voluntarily participated in any sport for as long as I can possibly remember, I am going to spend the next wee while talking to you about athletic events. Bear with me. It is actually going to be brilliant. I should be upfront with you about something. I am not a sporty person. And that's not false modesty. It's a considered lifestyle position that I arrived at round about the age of 11 and haven't revisited since. I did play netball in primary school and I was actually quite good at netball, but then I stopped because, well, I was 11, I found other things to do, and it turns out if you stop doing sport at 11, it's unlikely that you're going to go back. And guess what? Life continues perfectly well. I'm definitely not a runner unless something terrifying is chasing me. I can't jump particularly high, and physical strength is not an area in which I have chosen to invest. I don't watch sports, I don't follow teams, although I will tune in for Scotland if they're playing rugby or football, but that's national pride rather than sporting interest. I'm here for the Scotland part, not the sport part. I'd probably watch Scotland compete in competitive ironing if they made it an Olympic discipline. And I mention all this because I think it's relevant. If I, someone who hasn't played sports since childhood and would genuinely rather watch paint dry than watch teams play sport on television, find the Highland Games genuinely enthusiastically brilliant, then they are genuinely enthusiastically brilliant. This is not a sporting event that requires any sporting interest to appreciate. It's a spectacle. It's a theatre. It is, in places, gloriously ridiculous in a way that Scotland seems to understand as a feature rather than a flaw. The Highland Games exist at a very specific Scottish intersection. Fierce national pride, extraordinary physical skill, a long history, and the cheerful willingness to organise an entire day around throwing things. It's perfect. Episodes 2 and 3 went to some fairly heavy places. Culloden, the destruction of the clan system, the kind of history that sits with you for a while after you've heard it. And then Isla, which was joyful and reflective, because the best places always make you think as well as feel. But episode 5 is a deliberate pivot, because Scotland is also this. It's the pipe bands and the cabers and the kilts and the stalls with homemade tablet on them. The sheer joy of it. Scotland doesn't spend all its time being dramatic and historically significant. Some of the time it's just a large group of people in a field watching a man throw a tree and considering that a perfectly good way to spend a Saturday. And I didn't want that part of the picture to have to wait any longer. So, where did the Highland Games come from? The answer is, a very long time ago, and a king who needed a really fast runner. Around 1040, which is the same century as Macbeth, just to give you a sense of how far back we're going, King Malcolm III held a gathering at Braw. He needed to find a royal messenger, someone quick and reliable who could cover difficult terrain at speed. He did what any sensible king does when faced with a staffing problem. He organised a competition. He asked the local men to race up a steep hill called Craighonyick, and whoever got to the top first got the job. The prize, one imagines, was much less glamorous than it sounds. The role of a royal messenger in 11th century Scotland involved a great deal of running in difficult weather, with no guarantee of a warm welcome at the other end. But it was presumably better than the alternatives. And that hill race is still run at Braw today. The hill is still there. It's still steep. The record is considerably faster than anything Malcolm's messengers were achieving, which says something either about improvements in athletic training or the incentives offered. Over the following centuries, the gatherings evolved into something much more social. Places for clans to meet, to trade, settle disputes, and of course compete. The athletic events showed off skills that were genuinely useful in Highland life. Strength, speed, and endurance. A man who could throw a heavy stone further than his neighbours or outrun a rival across rough ground was a man worth having. This is Scotland's version of a job interview. The interview was a field, the questions were physical, and the correct answer was apparently to throw something very heavy very far. After Culloden in 1746, and we talked about Culloden in episode 2, the British government tried very hard to dismantle Highland culture. Kilts, banned. Gaelic, suppressed. The clan system, dismantled. It was a systematic attempt to erase a way of life. And the Highland Games, they quietly survived it. Men gathering in a field and throwing things was somehow difficult to classify as rebellion, even for a government that was trying very hard to find things to prohibit. So the tradition continued, underground and underappreciated, keeping Highland identity alive while everything around it was being deliberately taken apart. When the Dress Act was repealed in 1782 and the Victorian Highland revival began, helped considerably by King George IV visiting Edinburgh in 1822 and being seen to wear a kilt with pink tights, a sight that I'm sure was as ridiculous as it sounds. But the Games came back into fashion with considerable enthusiasm. Queen Victoria attended Braw for the first time in 1848, and then she came back every year that she could. The royal family has attended Braw every September since. Over 127 consecutive years of royal attendance at a field sports day in Aberdeenshire, which goes to show Some traditions are simply meant to continue indefinitely. What actually happens at the Highland Games, I hear you ask? Well, let me take you through the events, because each one deserves a moment. The main athletic competitions are called the heavy events. This name does a lot of work and is also, as you're about to discover, an understatement of some magnitude. We'll come back to the caber separately because it's earned its own section. Alongside the caber, the heavy events are as follows. The Scottish hammer. This is a 22-pound iron ball on a rigid wooden or bamboo shaft. You stand in a fixed position. Swing the hammer overhead in full circles and release it for distance. No run up, no spin, just overhead rotational power applied to a 22-pound iron ball in a field in front of several thousand people who think this is a perfectly reasonable way to spend an afternoon. The world record for the Scottish hammer exceeds 140 feet. I want you to sit with the number 140 feet just for a moment. That's nearly 50 metres of a 22-pound iron ball thrown with the arms by a person. The stone putt. Scotland's version of the shot put, except with an actual stone from an actual field, because Scotland does not see the need to replace perfectly serviceable existing materials. Two versions, the Braw stone, which you putt from a standing position with no run-up, and the open stone, where you get a short approach. The Braw stone is almost certainly the direct ancestor of the Olympic shot put. The next time you watch the shot put at the Olympics, know it began with someone picking a stone off the ground in Aberdeenshire and seeing how far they could throw it. The weight over bar. A 56-pound iron weight on a chain, hurled one-handed up and over a raised horizontal bar. The bar is raised progressively as the competition continues. Elite athletes clear heights above 16 feet with one hand holding 56 pounds. I genuinely don't know what I want you to do with this information, except to just take a moment to think about it. Now, the piping. I mentioned in the opening that there's a warm-up version of the pipes and then there's the playing version. In competition, you get only the playing version and it's something else entirely. The competition piping at Braw is serious. World-class musicians at the top end, an entirely incongruous setting where the nearest thing to them might be a man preparing to throw a boulder. But that juxtaposition is very Highland Games. Ancient, formal, technically demanding classical music happening in a field in Aberdeenshire next to the hammer competition. Scotland considers this entirely normal, and I kind of have to agree. There is a form of classical piping called pibroch, which is one of the oldest surviving classical music traditions in Europe. Structured, complex and ancient. If you get the chance to hear a competition pibroch performance, give it your full attention. It will do something to you that you will not entirely be able to explain to the people who weren't there. And then there's Highland dancing. I am going to need to address the look that appears on some people's faces when you mention Highland dancing in the context of a sporting event. I know the look, I've seen it. It's the expression of someone who is quietly thinking, but it's dancing though. The person is wrong, and allow me to explain. The sword dance, or the gilly callum, involves dancing at speed between and over two crossed swords laid on the ground, without touching them. If you touch a sword, you lose a point. The footwork is precise to the millimetre, performed at a pace by people who have been training for years to make it look effortless. It does not look effortless when you watch it. It looks extremely difficult and done very well. The legend of sword dance is that it began with King Malcolm III. Yes, the same one from 1040. I know, he's having quite the episode today. who, after a victorious battle, crossed his sword with his defeated enemy's sword and danced over them in celebration. Scotland has been celebrating victories by doing complicated things with swords ever since. It just seems right. The Highland Fling is performed entirely on the spot. No travelling, just the one position for the duration of the dance, requiring core strength and balance that makes the word dancing feel inadequate. These dancers train as hard as any athlete at the Games. They are athletes. They just do it in a kilt, on a stage, in a field, to the sound of a pipe band, while a hammer competition is happening 50 metres away. I have watched Highland dancing many times, and what surprised me most is the focus. They're often very young competitors, children and teenagers mostly, with the kind of total concentration that makes you realise you're watching something that has been worked on for years. There's no showboating, no performance for the crowd, just the dance, the music, and a level of precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker feel inadequate. And now, the caber, which gets its own section because I think it's earned it. A caber is a large section of pine tree, not a branch, not a plank, a section of pine tree trunk. 19 feet, 9 inches long in the case of the famous Braw caber, weighing 175 pounds. It is stood upright. An athlete cups their hands under the narrow end, the lighter end, which is still very heavy, and then lifts. They are now holding a 175 pound tree trunk vertically with the heavy end in the air above them. They run with it. They build speed, they plant their foot, and they heave the whole thing upwards and forwards, end over end through the air. And I had, watching this for the first time, two thoughts in very quick succession. The first thought was, how does a person even learn to do this? At what point in your life do you decide caber tossing is the skill you would like to develop? What does the progression look like? Do you start with a wee log and work your way up? Is there a beginner's caber? Who was the first person that looked at a pine tree and thought, I bet I could throw that? These questions came to me very quickly, and I want you to know I still don't have any satisfying answers for any of them. The second thought, arriving immediately after, was, I kind of understand why you would want to do this, because watching someone toss a caber, well, watching them run with this enormous thing, find their movement and leave it perfectly, is one of the most satisfying things I've ever seen. There's something about the scale of it, the sheer physical ambition of it, that makes the rest of ordinary human activity seem slightly small by comparison. But here, and this is the part I think is genuinely brilliant about the caber toss, here is how it's judged. Not on distance, not on height, not on how far it goes or how high it goes or how many people have to get out of the way. On straightness. A perfect caber toss, called a 12 o'clock, is when the caber lands pointing directly away from the thrower. Like a clock hand at noon, perfectly straight, that is the ideal. You can throw it 50 yards and lose to someone who threw it 30 yards in a perfectly straight line. Distance is completely irrelevant. Only the line matters. I love this. I love it because it's so specifically perfectly Scottish in its logic. You're not competing against the world. You're not trying to beat a record or intimidate the other competitors with raw distance. You're competing against a standard of perfection that exists independently of everyone else in the field. Brute force is simply not enough. Being the strongest person there gets you nowhere if your line is off. The technique, the timing, the judgment, these matter as much as the physical power. You can be stronger than everyone and still lose because you weren't precise enough. And that is, when you think about it, a fairly decent philosophy for life generally, not just for throwing trees, although it is mainly for throwing trees. The Braw caber, incidentally, went untossed for decades. Various athletes tried, year after year, and failed. It developed a reputation as essentially impossible. £175 of pine tree that nobody could get to go straight. And then, in 1951, someone did. No fanfare about how they trained or who they were or what changed, just it was first tossed cleanly in 1951. Scotland records the facts, Scotland moves on. A £175 tree had been successfully thrown. Next question. I want to say something about kilts, because the Highland Games are absolutely full of them, and it would be wrong to pass this over in silence. I am of the firm, considered opinion that a kilt is the most flattering garment ever created. I say this as someone who's observed a great many people wearing a great many things over many years, in various professional and personal contexts. A kilt is the great equaliser. Put almost any man in a properly fitted kilt and something happens to how he holds himself. There's a confidence in it, a particular way of standing that the kilt seems to require by its very construction. The Highland Games is an excellent place to conduct research in this matter, as the sample size is substantial. Now, I said almost any man, and I'm going to leave that word sitting there and move on, because I do have standards, and this is a podcast about Scotland. The two things are not always compatible, but I do my best. The Highland Games are now held in over 70 countries. Not 70 venues in Scotland, 70 countries globally. The United States holds hundreds of events every year. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Brazil. There are even Highland Games in Japan, where local competitors who have no Scottish heritage whatsoever have simply decided the whole enterprise is magnificent and honestly, correct. And how did this happen? The same way much of Scotland ended up across the world, the Highland clearances, which we will talk about properly in another episode. Scattered Scottish communities from the 1750s to the 1880s, people removed from land their families had farmed for generations, put on ships and sent to wherever the ships were going. They took almost nothing, but they did take their culture. And wherever they arrived, they built Scottish societies, they held gatherings, and eventually, somebody threw a caber. In North Carolina, there are families who have held Highland Games going back 6 generations, descended from Highlanders who left Scotland in the 18th century and never came back. In Cape Breton in Nova Scotia, there are Scottish communities who still speak Gaelic, whose ancestors were cleared from the glens 200 years ago. The games are what they carried, the games are what they kept. Scotland sent its people out, often against their will. Its people carried Scotland with them. The caber toss in a field in North Carolina is a person saying, I know where I come from. That's not nothing. That is, quietly, everything. Some practical Highland Game advice, because you should go, and here is what I know from having been. The game season runs from May through September, peaking in July, August and September. Braw in early September is by far the most famous, but famous does mean busy, and busy in Aberdeenshire in September means the full range of Scottish weather doing its best and worst simultaneously. Go if you can, the atmosphere is extraordinary, and it has that royal association that gives it a particular quality. But if you want your first games to be slightly more relaxed, Crieff in Perthshire or Inveraray in Argyll will give you the full experience with a bit more room to move around and eat a Scottish pie without elbowing someone. Arrive early. The heavy events start earlier than you expect and the viewing spots fill up. Find the piping, not just the marching bands, but the competition piping, which is a different and quieter experience and one you won't forget. Watch the Highland dancing with proper attention, and at some point in the afternoon, find yourself a position near the caber competition and just watch. You will have questions. The questions will never be satisfactorily answered. Just embrace this. And the food. Whatever is being sold from whatever table or van you encounter, just eat it. This is not the occasion for restraint. You're in a field in Scotland in September. Tablet is mandatory. And that brings us nicely on to this week's listener stories. The first email is from Henrik from Hamburg in Germany. And Henrik says, I have no Scottish heritage at all. I'm a German man who became obsessed with Scotland after a hiking trip to the Cairngorms in 2019, where it rained for 4 days straight and I still had the best week of my life. I stumbled across the Everything Scotland podcast. It's made me laugh that every episode has mentioned something about the crazy Scottish weather. It made me realise that I wasn't just unlucky, this is just how Scotland is. I can confirm for you, Hendrik, that is indeed the way Scotland's weather actually is. Next, we have Maria from Santa Fe in New Mexico. And Maria says, my connection to Scotland is really very simple. I watched Outlander. I know how that sounds, but then I started reading about the actual history and learning about the Jacobites and the clearances, the people who left and the people who stayed. And it turns out the real story is far more interesting than anything they put on the television. I am now a person who has opinions about Culloden and I'm saving up to come and visit for myself. Well, we hope to see you here soon, Maria. And finally, we have Mandy from Florida. And Mandy says, I love landscape photography and I knew I was going to be spoiled for choice in Scotland. Everyone talks about the rain, but no one talks about how the hills look just after the rain stops. I have photographed on 4 continents and I have never encountered light like the west coast of Scotland. If I ever get the chance, I would love to go back. Who knows when that might happen? Well, hopefully that happens for you soon, Mandy. Thank you again to everybody who took the time to send me an email. I really do love reading through them all. And if you would like me to read your Scotland story out on the podcast, you can find the address to send it to in the episode description. And that, lovely listeners, brings us on to your Scots word of the week. And this week it's Braw. B-R-A-W. And it means fine, excellent, wonderful, handsome. A braw day at the games. That was a braw toss of the caber. Or he's a braw big lad. It's a warm word. One of those words that sounds like what it means. Open and wholesome and genuinely positive. It is the opposite of dreich. If dreich is grey skies and resignation, braw is the moment the sun comes out and everything looks different. A braw caber toss is a 12 o'clock. A braw day at the games is one where the pipes are playing, the hammer is flying, and there is someone selling homemade tablet from a stall in the corner. And there's someone in a kilt about to do something that raises significant questions about the human relationship with very large pieces of wood. Scotland, in other words, being entirely and magnificently itself. Next week on Everything Scotland, we are going to a city, Edinburgh. The castle on the volcanic rock that has never been taken by a frontal assault, the underground streets sealed since the 1700s, the 5 writers who couldn't escape the city even when they left it, and every August the largest arts festival on earth, which started in 1947 because 8 theatre companies weren't invited to the official one and decided to perform anyway. Edinburgh in a nutshell, really. I'm Lesley Kennedy. This is Everything Scotland. Slán